Hello, I can see some waves. Lovely to see you all. So welcome to this masterclass on how to prioritise what matters in internal comms. My name is Jenni Field and I'll give you a more formal introduction of me shortly. But I just want to say a big thank you to the team at WorkVivo by Zoom for hosting these masterclasses. I think this is my 5th one with them now. We've got one more to do and I'll be sharing more about that later. But it's with thanks to them that we're able to do this. When we first started chatting a little while ago, we talked about all the things that were important for internal communicators, both in 2024 and in 2025. So we've picked masterclasses that we think are going to make a real difference. And this was one that we talked about towards the end of last year, just based on all of the questions that were coming through when I was talking about how to do your strategy and what the trends are and all of those things, and how to prioritize work and manage stakeholders just kept coming up and up. So that's what we're going to cover today. As always, I will leave time for questions, so please use the Q&A section where you can ask as many questions as you like, and I will get through as many of them as I can. But with all of that waffle, I will get us started because we've got a packed agenda today. So this is me. If I haven't met you before, my name is Jenni Field. I'm CEO of a consultancy called Redefining Communications, where we help leaders with their credibility and we help organizations with their internal communication. I've published a couple of books. I also have a podcast called Redefining Comms with Jenni Field. I've done quite a bit of research in the field of communication as well. And I'm also a big reader, so I'll be talking about some books a bit later that you have the chance of winning. And you'll have a chance of winning a couple of books if you share your top takeaway from this session. So pay attention, because I'll ask you to share your top takeaway, tagging both me and the team at WorkVivo in that LinkedIn post, and then you'll be in with a chance of winning one of 2 books that I always come back to when it comes to prioritizing my time and looking at how I can manage stakeholders and things like that a little bit more. So what are we going to talk about today? I've got a few models to share with you today, which some of you might be like, oh, I hate a model. But when it comes to stakeholders and managing them, there are about 4 or 5 that I'm going to cover. Some are super detailed if you've got the time to do that. Others are much simpler. So I'm trying to give you things that will work for you depending on your team size, depending on your sort of time and space as well. I'm going to talk about how to deal with procrastination. We're going to talk about false urgency, which exists everywhere. And we're going to talk a bit about planning and the importance of that as well. Now, when I do one-to-one coaching and mentoring with comms professionals, talking about planning always comes up. It's always on the agenda where I talk about making time to plan, being able to show your planning when you're working with leaders so they can see your capability and they can see your thinking and the strategic thinking as well. So I know sometimes it feels like we're just caught on a bit of a hamster wheel, but it's important for us to take the time to do some of this stuff because it saves us pain in the long run, I promise. Now, what I didn't mention when I introduced myself, for those of you I haven't met, I did spend about 15 years working inside organizations before I became a consultant. So the things I'm going to talk to you about are the things that I used when I worked inside organizations as a communications director or a global head of comms. But there are also things that I've learned along the way where I've been teaching and doing different things like that as well. So you've got a mix in here of consultancy stuff and then stuff I've used as well. I always start when it comes to procrastination, prioritization, managing stakeholders with just a little bit about understanding ourselves. And this is twofold really, because it helps us understand why we need to plan. And it also helps us understand why communication is really important. So if we just think about the fact that as human beings, we've existed for a very long time, the world around us has changed a huge amount in that time. But our brains haven't really changed at all. So our brains are still designed in the same way as they were years and years and years ago, where we were just hunting, gathering, and trying to stay safe. And that's what our brains are always trying to do. They're trying to keep us safe all the time. And to do that, they need to predict what's going to happen. If we can't predict what's going to happen, we don't feel safe because we end up in this sort of ambiguity spiral where we don't know what's going on, and then we go into a state of threat. Now, I'll always remember one of my old bosses saying to me, Jenni, in that tone, Jenni, you just need to get comfortable with ambiguity. And when I started to read more about how we work as human beings, I learned that none of us are comfortable with this. So we want to make sure that we can predict what's going to happen because our brains want us to stay safe. If it's ambiguous, if we don't know what's coming, we go into a state of threat. This happens to us all the time when there might be a situation where we're waiting for test results, for example. And because we don't know what's going to happen, we don't feel safe. Our brains are trying to predict, so they'll come up with all the scenarios that could possibly happen. And that's not very pleasant to be in, because we're in a state of threat then. Once we get those test results and we know what's happening, we can make a plan and we're okay, regardless of the outcome of that test. That planning and predictability is really important. A few other things about our brains to know when it comes to things like prioritization, workload, managing things, is that we like reward. So we will focus on a threat more than a reward, but we like to be rewarded for things that we're doing. So our brains quite like that. We like to feel like we've been recognized for doing work that we're doing, but we also really like novelty. So if we're stuck doing the same thing and the same routine, and there's something shiny over here, we're going to pay attention to that. It's a bit like when you're working on some sort of detailed spreadsheet in the office and somebody comes over and you sort of hear a bit of a conversation, and then you're quite engrossed in listening to that conversation because it's novelty and it's something different to what I'm doing now. So our brains like to mix things up, and that's important for us when it comes to the tasks that we're doing, because we don't like doing the same thing again and again and again. Two other things about the brain is that fairness is very important to us. We like to be treated fairly. We like others to be treated fairly. And if things aren't fair, our brain responds in a very similar way to kind of physical pain. So fairness becomes very important. And I think that's where sometimes we struggle with our stakeholders, because we want to treat everybody fairly, but we can't quite do it. And it becomes a little bit discombobulating is the only word I've got there to say. It becomes a little bit confusing, that's a better word. And then the last point really is that we're very emotional creatures. We make a lot of our decisions based on our emotion rather than logic. And that's very important when it comes to influencing stakeholders and working with them, because our decisions are made in probably quite a different way to how we might like to think they're made. Now, I've shared that whistle-stop tour of our brain because it explains why communication is important. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen to feel safe. But it also shows why we like a plan, because we like to be able to know what's coming down the road. We like a to-do list. We like to know what's coming. And when things come in out of left field and we're not sort of planned for it, it can knock us off a little bit. Some of us more than others, depending on how we can deal with that. But it can be quite jarring when you've got quite a strict plan that you're trying to create. And when you've got all these stakeholders and different things coming in, it makes that very, very difficult for us to manage. But we have to manage our stakeholders. Now, I did a previous masterclass with the team at WorkVivo by Zoom on how to influence leaders. If you didn't catch that, I'd recommend going and checking it out, because it will help you with some of that influencing relationship with your stakeholders. I'm not going to cover that today because we've already done it. But if you've got any questions around that, just let me know in the chat, or you can just DM me on LinkedIn afterwards. That's absolutely fine. But our stakeholders do have to be managed, but we have to be able to define them. And sometimes we say the word stakeholder and we just assume that people know who we're talking about. But you should have a list really of who your stakeholders are. And they are anybody that is sort of directly related to the organization, what it's doing, things like that. It could be employees, managers, departments, it could be suppliers, customers, investors. You might not be too worried about the external. You might have both of them as people you look after, but you should be able to list your stakeholders. And you can list these quite broad at the beginning, but we want to get as narrow as we can into stakeholder groups. So we're getting much narrower in terms of their demographic or their grouping or things like that, because otherwise it becomes quite difficult to manage. But we have to manage our stakeholders because of the risk, really. There is a huge risk to us, both reputationally and financially, if we're not aware of some of these stakeholder groups. And I know from my experience, there's been situations where I've worked in organizations where we've had protesters turning up, we've had investor meetings, we've had brand partnerships coming in. There's been all sorts of different stakeholders to consider. And when it comes to how you communicate, it's really important that we understand how our messaging and our content might impact those different groups. And sometimes the people that are asking us to communicate haven't considered some of those. And that's part of our job, to make sure that we're considering all of those different audience groups that might be impacted, because sometimes those audience groups don't have a particularly strong voice, or they're just not recognized in some parts of the organization because they just haven't come across them before and wouldn't consider that group to be impacted by something else. So we have quite a job to do when it comes to looking at our stakeholders for us as communication professionals, but also looking at the stakeholders that are impacted by the work that we do. So So many stakeholders to think about, but very important for us to understand who they are. So first model is identifying them using the 4-box grid of impact and influence. So this is one of the sort of first models that I started to use, and this is probably where I started when I was an internal communications officer. Don't ask me why I was an officer, because I don't know why that was in my title. There was no other officer in the organization, but I was an officer. And this is where I sort of started to look at stakeholders. So I wanted to look at the influence or power of the stakeholder, which is what we've got sort of going up and down. And then we've got the interest of the stakeholder along the bottom. So we want to understand where they fit. So we've got sort of this least important group in the orange because their influence or power is really low and their interest is really low. So they're not very important. So we can sort of put them over there. What we want to think about is this key player who's both got a high level of influence and power and also a high level of interest. So these are the 4 questions that I tend to come back to when I'm looking at this group. And quite often when I'm using grids like this, there's going to be a few grids today, I've got an A3 bit of paper or an A2 bit of paper, and I have post-it notes or mini post-it notes, which I know for some people might feel a little bit old school because you can use various different online boards, but the physicality for me of writing it out and moving it helps it kind of go more into my brain. So I like to do it more that way. So I'd have groups of people on post-it notes and I'd be moving them around, and they might be specific teams. They might have someone's name on there. That could be a stakeholder. It doesn't need to be a group of people, but we want to understand what their interest is in the project or what we're doing. Do they have any influence in that project? Do they have any control over that project? And where is that power? Like, do we need them or do they need us? And where does that sit in this sort of stakeholder relationship? Because we want to try and get a bit of power balance in there. But this is the sort of first model I would come to when you're looking at your stakeholders. Now, I've started with this stakeholder piece because if we want to prioritize what we're doing, we need to understand the significance and importance of the people that are asking us. And we need to know whether people are just noisy or if they are genuinely in need of support and help. And this is where this next model came in when I was doing some teaching on the internal communications diploma. I started to look a little bit more at how do we sort of delve a bit deeper into stakeholders, because the 4-box grid, hugely helpful, but sometimes there's a lot more sort of power and things going on. So this is the 7 classes of stakeholder, and it's a Venn diagram that you can see on the right-hand side. And it's looking at the urgency of the stakeholder, looking at the power that they have, and then the legitimacy of their claim, which I think is very important. So as you can see in the purple circle, we have a demanding stakeholder who is just saying everything's very, very urgent. Now, I feel like every person that has worked in a communication or an HR role will say they are familiar with the demanding stakeholders, because I know I have some in my history. But then we also might have people that are very dormant, so very powerful, but not really urgency or anything like that. So they're just kind of staying up there. When you combine that urgency with the power, you've got quite a dangerous stakeholder. And that means we need to probably give that a little bit of attention. But we need to kind of figure out this legitimacy as well, because if it's all legitimacy, it's just sort of discretionary. They've got a legitimate interest, but they haven't got any urgency or any power. So we can start to see how they can sort of map into some of these places, and certainly start to think about, is this person just being very noisy, or do they have a legitimate involvement in this? Are they actually part of this? And that sometimes can be quite challenging, because when people are very noisy, it makes us feel like we have to respond to them. And I said to somebody actually just this week, we were talking about somebody cancelling something very last minute. And I said, oh, once you've cancelled that, like that time is gone. And my friend was saying, oh gosh, you're quite mean. And I said, no, it's in the rules. And I don't want someone else's chaos to become my chaos. That's not how this works. And I think once you absorb someone else's chaos to be yours, you suddenly allow that to be okay. And then it becomes your problem when it's not my problem. And that's sometimes what happens with stakeholders that are very demanding, is they're kind of pushing that urgency onto you. And actually that's not fair. That's their urgency, and they need to go away and deal with that. And this one is my favorite one, because I think it's the easiest one to get your hands on straight away. And I do have a bit of a sort of template for this, but honestly, you can just use it in a spreadsheet type thing. But if you want more details, then I also always say just DM me on LinkedIn and I can send you some stuff. But this is the RACI. Now, you might have seen this as a RACI, so it didn't have the S. But when I used to use this, we had the S in there, mainly because as a communication professional, S is very, very helpful. Support comes in a lot. So if you're not familiar with this, you would use this as a sort of table or a spreadsheet, and you'd have a list of the activity that needs to happen. So on a project, you might have a list of different things that need to happen, whether it's we need to create an intranet page for this, we need to get the Q&A finalized, we need to get the key messages agreed, we need to brief this group of people, like whatever it is, you'll have all these things that need to happen. And then you'll have someone that's responsible for that. That's the person that's doing that piece of work. You can only put one name in that column against that thing. You can't put a team name in, and you can't put like 5 names in, because if we're all responsible, no one's responsible. It has to be one person. Then you've got someone that's accountable. Again, has to be one person, not a team, but somebody is accountable for this actually happening. So it's usually the director or somebody at a very senior level. Then you might have someone that supports that. So if it's a communication activity, something to do with the intranet, maybe something like that, you'd have maybe IT that need to support that, or you might need HR to support, or you might need facilities, something like that. You might need to consult with, I'm trying to think of another department now. You might need to consult with operations, because the impact on operations with this communication is quite important. So we need to consult with them before we do that action. And then we just need to inform whatever stakeholder group needs to be informed. So support, consult, and inform can have team names, or it can have multiple individual names, but the responsible and the accountable, just individual names of people. And I used this loads when I was communications director, because I was working in an organization that had recently merged, sort of acquired. It was a bit messy. And we needed to have real clarity over who was doing what. And then we had a timeline that went over the top of that. This is hugely helpful if your challenge with prioritizing work and managing stakeholders is coming from a place of people don't really know what their role is in this project, or they don't really know what they're meant to be doing. And this just clears all of that out so that everyone's very clear on their role and responsibility. So I've used this a lot. The organization I worked for did overuse it slightly, but it's been very, very helpful. And it's the easiest one to put in when you're doing any kind of project work. So I would now, when I work with clients one-to-one, we kind of bolt it onto the communications planning. So you've got your comms plan, which is your table and your chart of when everything's happening. And then we've kind of got that RACI at the bottom, just so everybody's really clear in terms of where people sit. Also important, because some people might think they're responsible and they're not. And some people might think they're in a consult bucket, but you've got them in an inform bucket. And that's where it gets messy. So it's important to have that discussion around them and discuss where people are, because it's really, really useful. So that's my favorite one. The other two are really good. They're just a bit heavier, I would say, in terms of models, whereas this one is a bit more practical to use. So the other thing to think about when it comes to prioritizing your work is to make sure that what you're doing is adding value. It's very easy to get stuck doing stuff that isn't actually adding value to the organization or to what you need to do. Now, sometimes there is work that comes in that you have to do, like, can you communicate this? Can you communicate that? And it can feel a bit chaotic because there's lots of things coming in, but you control the channel, they control the content. Okay, you are responsible for your channels. You are responsible for that communication in the organization. So with that responsibility comes the need to be able to say yes and no to people and explain why, but it comes with that responsibility to say, we can't do this today because of this. There'll be a reason. You're not just going to say, no, we can't. And that why is what's really important. If you don't know why you need to communicate something because you can't see how it adds value, that's where you start to have the conversation about, can you help me understand how this links to the strategy, just so I can see where it needs to sit on the intranet, how I can understand how the campaign might need to work. These are all questions that we have to ask if we're not really sure what it's doing. If you don't know, your audience definitely won't know. So I've used a briefing sheet in the past where I have a series of questions which allowed me to understand the importance and the priority of that piece of work. Again, I can send you the briefing sheet if you'd like it. But This was what allowed me to know whether it was something that had budget, it was something that needed to go out now because it was linked to a specific project or the timeline was important. And it allowed for that conversation. I didn't do a briefing sheet for everything, like that would have driven my stakeholders mental. But I did use it for the big campaign stuff. Or if somebody would say, Jenny, we need some help with communicating this new initiative, can we have a meeting to talk about it? I would take the briefing sheet and I would fill that in during the conversation, because it would allow me to just have the prompts that I would need for those discussions. And I could then at the end of that say, okay, yeah, no, we could just do a post on the intranet for this, or we can talk about it in the town hall. You don't need a whole campaign around this based on what you've shared with me now. So the briefing sheet and those are very helpful to help you make that judgment call. One of the questions we had for this masterclass, I was looking through them earlier today, was how do I know what to prioritize? Is it just judgment or is it something else? And ultimately, it is judgment. And that's where your experience and your time in doing this role really starts to pay off, because you'll be able to do this much quicker the more senior you become. If you don't know, and if that for you is a really uncomfortable position to be in, to say, I just don't know, I don't have the experience yet to know whether this is important or not. It's a very senior person and they're very demanding and I don't want to say no to them because it might impact my career. That's where you need to work with some of your peers and discuss it with them. Okay? There's no harm in having a conversation to say, look, Frank's come to me with this and I don't know whether it's important or not. You're a bit closer to the strategy. What do you think? Right? These are all fine conversations to have, but don't just take it as gospel that because Frank shouts really loud and because Frank's quite senior, that this needs to happen before everything else. Because discussing timeframes is really important. I used to talk, well, I was talking to some clients recently and they were getting really anxious, but they were getting really worked up about the launch of certain things. And I said, why are we launching it in 3 weeks? And they all just sat there and sort of looked at each other and then at me and then said, well, we don't really know. And I was like, okay, well, could we launch it in 8 weeks? And they all sort of went, well, yeah, really, like we've created a deadline, we've created a need for this that isn't really there, but it's just asking those questions and having that discussion that slows it down. And if you feel like there is a lot of stuff coming at you and it feels really hectic, there's ways that you can control that pace. So you can pick up the phone and talk to somebody. You can send them a quick email to say, I've received your request, but we need to have a conversation. Can we have 5 minutes at the end of the day if they don't like a phone call? Like whatever it is, you can control the pace of things and you can bring that pace down. And that's really important to recognize that we have our ability to do that. We control the channels, we control what's happening, we can slow that pace down. Because if they're running at 100 miles an hour, again, doesn't mean their chaos becomes your chaos. You can calm that down and you can move them kind of where you want them to be. But this false urgency is everywhere. And I see it all the time with people. And I do it to myself sometimes. And I think we can all be a bit guilty of thinking everything is really, really urgent. I have said this for decades. As soon as possible is not a deadline. If someone says to me, as soon as possible, I don't know what that means. Because I don't know what as soon as possible is. I've got lots of other things I need to do. I also don't particularly want to do this. So it's going to go to the bottom of the list. So that means as soon as possible could be about 6 months away. Like it doesn't help me manage my workload and your expectations. So when people say to me, I need that as soon as possible, I will always go back and say, I'm going to need a deadline because as soon as possible to you is not as soon as possible to me. So let me know when you really need it. And kind of force their hand a little bit, because it's easy to chuck out an ASAP. Makes me feel like, oh, ASAP, darling. Like, no, no. If you want me to do this, it takes my time, means I've got to do something. I need to know when that is. And if they come back and say, oh, I don't really have a deadline, but just as soon as possible, which could happen, then say, okay, based on my current workload, I can do this at the end of the week. I can do it next week. I can do it in 3 weeks. You then control the deadline, but you have to know what your current workload is in order to be able to do that. If you don't know where your time is going, it makes it very difficult for you to be able to manage other people's deadlines and expectations if they don't know them themselves. So it's important to have that understanding about how you work and where your time is being spent, so that you can kind of manage that. One of the things I haven't put in here about managing your time is a sort of pie chart thing that I do with some clients, where I'll get them to do a circle and then map out a sort of a pie chart of where their time goes, with the segments of the pie being the amount of time. And then when we're looking at changing things, or we want to do things differently, we do a pie chart of where we want our time to be. And then we can talk about how we might change that. It's quite a good team exercise if you're looking at where time is being spent. And it's always quite eye-opening. I did it with a client recently, and they drew the circle and they just stood and looked at it for a few minutes. And my heart really broke for them, because they were like, I just don't know. I just don't know. And I was like, okay, well, we've talked about you were doing this and this. So we started to fill it in based on what we talked about. But that horrible, overwhelming feeling where you just don't know where your time is going, it's just horrible. But you can sort of pick through it if you could use some of these sort of techniques that will help. The other thing to do is to map the tasks to determine if they are urgent or important. And that also means that you have to define urgent for your team function, okay? Because I might come in and go, oh my God, this is urgent. It has to go out on Friday. And to me, that is not urgent. Urgent is it has to go out right now because the world's on fire. Like that's like something's happening really bad and this is urgent. But we have different interpretations of that word, and we have different interpretations of a lot of words. So if you want to, you could start to create a bit of a matrix that shows if something's urgent, this means X, Y, Z. If it's important, this means X, Y, Z. So you're starting to educate your stakeholders around the language that you might want them to use, and so that they can understand what then happens if they ask for it in that way. And this is another matrix. I said there were a few of those today. And this one is important, urgent, not important, not urgent. And then I've put in here what happens when it's in that box. So if it's not important or it's not urgent, you can just get rid of that. You can just go in the bin. If it's not important, but it is urgent, you might be able to delegate that to somebody else. So I used to have some people in my team, but I also had a roster of different agencies, copywriters, consultants, support people that I could kind of give stuff to as and when I was allowed to do that with budget and things. If you've got something that's important and urgent, then that goes on your to-do list. And if it's not urgent, but it's important, then you can schedule that in. The other thing I used to have when I worked inside organizations was my to-do list was a diary, which worked very well for how my brain worked, because I didn't want to keep things in there all the time. And I'm quite a pen and paper person. So I've got a remarkable tablet now, which kind of blends the two, but I still like a pen and paper. But I would put in, I'd have a sort of page a day diary. So if I needed to do something next week, I could put it in as my to-do list for next week. So I didn't have to sort of hold on to it. And that made my life a lot easier. Some people do that in their calendars. That just makes my brain hurt a bit. And some people do it on different planning schedules and different things like that. But having it in my diary as a to-do list was just the easiest way for me to not lose anything. So urgent, important matrix, really helpful. To level this up a notch, we want to add significance into that equation. So I was reading a book, listening to a book, which I finished on Friday, called Procrastinate on Purpose, How to Multiply Your Time. And I realized that how I think about time is a bit different to everybody else. But it was very helpful because I do a lot of the stuff in that book. But they were talking about this matrix, and that if you really want to sort of take this up to that next level, you've got to know what is significant for sort of longer term on here. So even though something might be not important and not urgent, and I've gone remove that, put that in the bin, that could have significance for much, much later down the line. So you've got to try and figure out what has significance to the organization, significance to you, your department, what you might need to do. And this might fall into things like the work that you're doing to build the communication function or build the communication strategy, because some of those tasks will go to the bottom of the list because you're too busy serving everybody else. But actually, if you invest time in those, does it have a significant impact in the future of your function and your team? So thinking about significance is something to also add in to just see whether we can make that a little bit sharper in terms of making sure that you're not just doing stuff that other people want you to do. Now, I've talked a lot about stakeholders, and I've talked a lot about how we might be able to sort of manage some of that. But when it comes to managing time, which everyone talks about. I don't have enough time. Time management is my biggest issue. We have to manage our attention, not our time. And this is about self-management more than anything else. Now, one of the books I'm going to talk a bit about later is a book called Busy. And it was one of the books I read when I first started my consultancy. And it talked in there about the fact that no one is busy when it's an excuse. And I use this all the time when I talk to people, because we're not busy, we're just prioritizing other things. So when people come back to me and say, oh, I haven't done that because I've been really busy. Well, you haven't, you've just prioritized other stuff. So if you find yourself using busy a lot, then try and reframe that a bit in terms of what you're prioritizing, and just check in with yourself to make sure that you're prioritizing things that are the right things for you and your goals and what you need to prioritize. Because otherwise you're just busy doing stuff that you don't need to be doing or don't want to be doing, and you control your time. I know at times it feels like you don't, but you do control your time and how you spend it. And we just have to be quite precious about how we protect that. Someone said to me recently, I thought you worked all the time, Jenny, because you seem to be, posting on LinkedIn and you're doing these events with Work Vivo, and then you're publishing books and you're doing this. And I started, I'm very strict about my attention. So I don't really have meetings before a certain time in the morning, and I generally finish them sort of mid-afternoon so that my attention is condensed in the right places. I focus my attention on Mondays to be with my team, and I use my attention on Fridays to just be reading and doing other things. But I'm very focused on where my attention is going so that it's not being wasted in different places, or it's intentionally being wasted by playing Candy Crush or Wordle or watching some nonsense on television. That's all fine, but I'm aware that's where my time is going, and that's what's important. So I'm going to take you through a couple of tricks and tips to help you think about your time and your attention and how you might use them in a way that feels a bit more focused. And these are things that I use regularly, and they are things I talk to people about all the time, but it's about testing them. So there's going to be things I'm going to share with you, which I've already shared with you, that might not be quite right for what you're doing, and that's fine. But I'd encourage you to test some, tweak them, adjust them, see how they might work for you, because that's how we learn how to manage our attention a bit more. So the first one is eating the frog, which comes from this horrible expression about eating a frog. And if I said to you, this frog, that would be gross. And it would be a really horrible thing to have to do. But if you ate that frog and it was horrible and gross, then the rest of the day would be wonderful, because you've done the worst thing you could ever possibly do. And that's where it stems from, is that if you do that one task that you don't want to do, that you know is the hardest task, that you've been putting off for ages, and if you can do that early on in the day, then the rest of your day will be a bit easier. Now, it does depend on what the task is, of course, but we have to let our it's plan over emotion, basically, which feels quite uncomfortable. But actually, if I worked on the basis that if I didn't go to the gym every time I didn't feel like it, I probably wouldn't go. And I'm doing Couch to 5K at the moment, and I don't want to go for a run sometimes, but it's part of the plan and I've got to do it. So I have to get past that emotional blocker that can sometimes come in. So eat the frog, do the gross thing first thing in the morning, and then there's nothing else that's as worse that day. The next one is setting timers. So I'm a big fan of timers and focusing my attention, and then I will reward myself once I've done this. So I will use usually 30-minute timers, 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and I will then give myself time to do a certain task. So I might have 30 minutes to be in my inbox to just clear that through. I might categorize stuff, reply to things, but I've got 30 minutes of focus time in my inbox. I might set myself a timer for 45 minutes, which is to allow me to write a presentation or get some ideas down on paper or whatever that might be. We can only really concentrate for about 52 minutes, and then we need about a 17-minute break. So we need to make sure that we are allowing ourselves that time, unless we get into really deep work where we can go on for quite a long time. But generally, that 45-minute rule is about right. If you can factor that in and you can set yourself some timers, you can then reward yourself once you've done that piece of work. And that reward might be a cup of tea, it might be going and chatting to a friend, it might be going for a walk around the block, it could be anything, but it's a good way of helping you reward the behaviours that you've done that have allowed you to focus your attention. I generally don't have more than 5 things in a day. And I feel like I can hear you gasp when I say this, because you're probably thinking, how on earth can I just have 5 things in a day? But this is where my page a day diary was really helpful, because if I was in an all-day meeting, that's still work, okay? But we sort of forget that sometimes, and we think that our work is actually sitting at our laptops and doing stuff. But being in meetings is work. Sometimes they're not as efficient as we'd like them to be, but it's still work. So if I'm in an all-day meeting, there is nothing on my to-do list that day, because I'm not going to get anything done, and I'm just going to set myself up for failure to do it. So it has to be done either the day before or the day after. But even if I've got 2 meetings in, then of those 5 things, 2 of those things are those meetings. Something else might be to write a report. I might have to do a contract work. I might have to do a presentation, whatever it is, 5. Because also having 5 gives me a bit of room if somebody comes in with something else, because they will, okay? Even in my business, I'll get an email and I'll have to do something that I haven't really thought about, or the phone will ring or something will happen, and that interrupts that. So you have to create room to breathe. If you're working at your maximum capacity possible and everything's kind of going okay at work, but you're just doing a lot, then if there is a crisis, you have nowhere to go. And that's what we've got to protect. And I remember doing this when I used to start work at 7:30. In the mornings, I was global, so we had Asia to talk to. So I'd be in early, and then I would work a bit late. And it got to the point where I was like, I don't know why I'm doing this. The business is doing well. I'm going to start leaving at 4 because that's fair. And I'm still contactable, we'd never not, are we, these days? But it means I can get to the gym and I can do other stuff. And my boss was absolutely fine. It felt very uncomfortable the first time I did it, leaving the office, but I needed somewhere to go. If something happened, there had to be space for me to do that. And if I'm cramming everything in, I don't have that room to kind of maneuver. So 5 things in a day is my other one. I want to sort of finish us on understanding procrastination, because I know it's something that comes up again and again and again. And I want to make sure we've still got time for some questions today as well. So I've done a bit of work on procrastination to understand it and look into it a bit more. I know some other people who have done some work looking into this as well, and I need to actually catch up with them to find out where their work's going. But I talk about this in my book, Nobody Believes You, because I'm talking about our capability and our ability for people to see that we're able to take action and do things. And procrastination sometimes gets in the way. So if we procrastinate too much, some of our stakeholders might think that we're not very good at doing the work because we're not taking action, because we're procrastinating about what we're doing. But there's 4 different types of procrastination, and it's not always bad. So the 4 different types are fear. What if this isn't right? Perfectionism. It's just not ready. Dependence. I'll do it when something, something, something. And mood of I'm just not in the mood today. Some procrastination can be really good. So if I think about designing these masterclasses for you, and I write the content for these masterclasses usually a couple of weeks beforehand, but I have to do them the week before so that we can sort of talk about them and discuss what I'm going to say. Now, I know what my next masterclass is. I haven't done my slides for that one, but I know my brain is working on that in the background. So when it's a big sort of thing that you're doing, your brain is going to be working on solving that problem as well. And it needs that space and quiet to think about that. So sometimes procrastination is fine because it's working away behind the scenes. And when you come sit down, it's just going to do it. It's not good if we're using it as an excuse. And these are the 4 where we're using it as an excuse. I'm really good at dependence. I've got better over the years because I've trained myself out of it. But I always used to have the whole, I'll start eating healthily on Monday. And that was always my dependence of it has to be Monday. Now I just try and be very consistent throughout the week. But that was always there for me as a bit of a dependence piece. But these are some things and some steps to help you. You might want to take a photo of this if you've got your phone handy, but these are the different procrastination types, and then some steps to enable action, because you've got to try and figure out which one of these you might have. Sometimes I have a mixture of them. Mood for me can sometimes be location. So working somewhere else is sometimes quite helpful for me. I struggled a lot in the pandemic when we were just at home because I was used to being in coffee shops and things like that. So I had to put YouTube coffee shop sounds on just to get me mentally in a different place. So sometimes it's identifying these and then finding the things you can do. So if perfectionism is one of them, which a lot of us have, we have to know what success looks like. And we have to think about the fact that progress is better than perfection. But if we can figure out what success looks like, then we know what done looks like, and then it makes it easier for us to be able to move on. But as I said, if we get stuck in this, and because we're overwhelmed and we can't do all of the things we're being asked of, and then we're stuck in this sort of fear, perfectionism, all of it, then the perception for our stakeholders isn't great because we're not doing the stuff that they're needing us to do. And then it just gets even more messy and spirally and horrible, which we don't want. So addressing procrastination is really important. Now, I've mentioned busy already. And these are two books that I'm going to gift to somebody on this masterclass. So one is How to Thrive in a World of Too Much, which is Busy by Tony Crabb. And then the other one is Feel Good Productivity by Ali Abdaal. And I had the pleasure of meeting Ali last year. And it was really interesting to hear his story about how he wrote the book and where it came from and just his whole journey, actually. But there's some really great stuff in there about goals and how to create nice goals rather than smart goals, and different things like that in there that are just very practical. So two different books, and I will let you choose. When the winner is selected, you can choose which one you would like out of those. But as I said, to be in with a chance of winning, you just have to post on LinkedIn your biggest takeaway from today, tag me and WorkVivo in that, and then we'll do a draw and see who the lucky winner is. So that is the end of the masterclass today. Quick mention of the next one, which is How to Manage Change Comms, which I'll be doing on the 11th of February. Again, I have a couple of models in there based on some of the different models that I've used. Not too model heavy, because I don't want it to be too theoretical. I want it to be much more practical on the change stuff. So that's my last masterclass with the team at WorkVivo. So I hope you can join me for that as well. And I'm sure the link is gone in the chat for you to sign up for that. But that's enough for me sharing slides. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And then hopefully I can see some of the lovely questions you've asked and I can answer some of them because I've got a good 15 minutes left. Put my clicker down now and I can see what you've asked. So we've got a question on here that says, how do you deal with a stakeholder who, despite being refused, still manages to get their request through, often via the hierarchy? Oh, this question comes up a lot. Thank you, Isabel. So this comes down to your influence and relationships, really. And also just people being difficult. I was going to say a slightly rude word there. People just being a bit difficult, which isn't particularly helpful. But this is about your relationship. So if there's someone that's going to go over you or around you, we need to go back to them. So if someone comes to me and I've said, no, we can't do that, that's not going to work. So it's all in that relationship of that saying no. And why we're saying no, and maybe what an alternative is. We can't just say no, we have to be helpful in those relationships. So if it is a no, why? But what's an alternative? If they don't like that alternative, then that's basically on them. But it's also in that negotiation with them. If they don't like the alternative and that's all you're willing to move on, then it is what it is. I would then go to my boss to say, I've just had this conversation with Gareth, and this is the conversation we've had. I'd really welcome your support in backing me in this, because this is why it's really important. I know from my experiences with my bosses, nearly every boss I had that was senior said to me, I don't ever want to be caught out by something that I don't know. So that managing upwards is quite helpful, because you're going to them first before you know that they're going to come around and do that. If that keeps happening, we have to have the conversation with your boss or the hierarchy to say, look, the impact of this is devaluing my credibility with this individual, and I need to have that credibility in order to do my job. So there's a lot of conversations to be had, but the impact of somebody going around you and that being okay just doesn't do you any favors in terms of your reputation. So you do have to kind of fight for that a little bit and fight for your place there. But that means you have to be really clear about why you're saying no and why that's happening. And that has to be based on almost more than your opinion. There has to be enough in there for somebody to go, okay, right, I get why we can't do this. Otherwise, it just gets a bit tit for tat, and that's a bit difficult. Another question we've got says, do you have a cheat sheet of questions to consider for an identified stakeholder and that relationship needs to be built? I don't really have a cheat sheet, Shauna. That's a good question. Maybe I should create one. I think I always start with stakeholders where I want to build a relationship. I think because I've always set up a communication function, I've been quite lucky in that my first sort of month is always having conversations and asking people what they want. So I'm always asking, what's the problem that you want me to solve? And if you're talking to me as a communication person, why am I here? Like, what's the problem? And what is it we're trying to achieve? Because if you've been brought in to set up a function, or you're new in or anything like that, they've identified a need and we have to know what that is. If it is an existing function, you've come in new, or you've been there a long time, a new person comes in, there's always a set of questions where I might go through, which would be more about things like, where you worked before, what did your communication team do? Did you like that? Did you not like that? What would you like to see here? Anything we can help you with? Do you find that you have good enough communication skills? And some of those sorts of questions. And I would also get to know them. One of the things I have done, it's not really a question for stakeholders, but when I've had a new senior person come in, like a new CEO, a new CFO, I've found out where they worked before, and then I've messaged the comms person on LinkedIn and gone for coffee with them to find out what they're like. Because I want to know what their perception of communication is and kind of what I'm dealing with. So there's lots of different ways round to build those relationships, but use a network and use people around you to do that. So that's what I would kind of do. But I always think it's fair to say, how can we help? And actually, I talk about this in my first book about internal communication. There was a program called New Amsterdam, which I was watching, I think, just before I was writing that. And it's a fictional medical drama. And this new chief comes in, and his question to everybody is, how can I help? And I've really adopted that in most of my opening conversations. So even when somebody just says, I've got this problem and we need this, I'll always start a conversation with, how can I help? Because it just opens the door to a conversation, and it's going in to listen without the need to win, without judgment. You're just listening, and that's really important. The procrastination book, Carla, is Procrastinate on Purpose: How to Multiply Your Time. I did a post on LinkedIn about it just yesterday, I think, where I talked about the 5 permissions that it talks about in there. So yes, it's on there. It's good. Rory Vaden wrote it, and he narrates it, and I listened to it. A question that's come in. Some of your advice worked very well during mid-career. As one rises and manage difficult stakeholders, ASAP is like ASAP, isn't it? I'm not entirely sure I know what you mean, but I think what you're saying is that as you go further up, it gets a little bit more difficult to navigate some of those stakeholders, because they just expect you to kind of be able to do things that quickly, and the language sort of shifts a bit. This all comes down to power dynamics a little bit for me, and we don't talk about power very much in organizations anymore, because it's become a bit of one of those words that people don't really like. They kind of feel like we shouldn't have this sort of power dynamic in organizations, and we should have some flat hierarchies, and that's often talked about. But actually, there is a power dynamic in organizations, and we have to try and get to a level where we've got power with rather than power over. And it's a big thing from Dr. Brene Brown, but it's about this sort of adult-child thing. If someone comes in at me as a stakeholder and says, Jenny, I need this ASAP, and sort of just throws it at me, that no. And let's have a conversation. But it's about getting on that level of that sort of power level of being the same, because even if you feel that you are at a junior level in your organization, or you feel like you're mid-career, we're all people, and actually we can all have a conversation, and we can all discuss deadlines, priorities. We can have that conversation. We just need to give ourselves permission to have that conversation, really. And I think that's what's important. Don't be put off by somebody being more senior. It's okay to ask the question, when do you need this by? Is this really urgent? All those sorts of things. So I just would always counsel that don't be put off by that. You have a voice, and we have to ask those questions. That's fine. We've got some more questions in. So in an organization where you are the only member of the communications team and are frequently pulled into high priority ASAP projects, how do you manage your workload effectively? So if I get pulled in and I've got lots going on, then I have to make the judgment call about whether or not I can be pulled in. So if there's other things on my list, can they shift to allow me to go in there? And that's my judgment call when we talked about judgment earlier. So if I've made the judgment call that I can, then I need to manage the stakeholders around these things that I'm shifting to allow me to do that. And I need to communicate with them and do all of that. And that's how I manage my workload. So I'm moving the pieces and I'm communicating that movement with those people. If I'm then pulled into this conversation, I know that there are a set of questions I need to ask to know what my involvement needs to be in this. So how urgent is this project? Who is impacted by this project? What do you want them to think? How do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? What's your budget for communicating this project? And what are the real-time scales and who is actually involved? And this is where tools like the RACI and stuff like that come in, because I'd start to plot that together and I'd start to build out what I needed to do with the timeline. Because it might be that I don't need to actually do very much for quite some time on this project, but I need to be aware of it. But I'm actually playing a supporting role in the first 10 actions that actually need to happen. And then I come into being a doer. I become responsible. So that's where some of these tools can start to come in, because you can start to map that. I did use the RACI for my whole workload for my comms list for a while. It just got a bit unnecessary. But sometimes it can be a good starting exercise when there's a lot of juggling priorities. We've got another question saying, can you share the briefing sheet? I can. Karen, drop me a DM on LinkedIn. I can pop it over to you, no problem after this. I think I've got time. Oh, I've got time for a few more. Good. How do you demonstrate the value of communications in achieving the company's overall business goals? The company don't seem to understand the impact on the communications department in the overall business goal. So I did some research into the value and impact of internal communication about 2017, I think, when I was involved with the Chartered Institute of PR. And some of the stuff in there was actually very helpful. We interviewed CEOs to ask them how we kind of prove the value. I think what's interesting about your question, Joy, is that if the company doesn't understand, what I'd love to know is, what are you seeing that's showing you they don't understand? So what are the behaviors that are happening that are showing you they don't understand that? Because if we can see that as like an outcome, we can start to figure out what might be driving that. So, and I do this through my kind of influence credibility piece. So if people don't think you're capable, then they will disrespect you. So if you're not being invited to meetings or you're not being included in things, that could be seen as a bit of disrespect. And that could be because they don't think you're capable of doing what they need you to do. That could be completely false. So we need to do more to kind of do the PR around that capability to show people that you are. But it depends on what you're seeing. So if you want to drop me a DM on LinkedIn and just expand on that a bit more, happy to voice note you back with some answers on what it might be. But the other thing I'll come back to is, if they don't see the value, sometimes it's because we're talking different languages. So we might use phrases like employee voice or employee experience and things like that. And they just might not be words used by the senior team. And I've often told this story about my old CEO who talked about value all the time. What value does it bring? What value does it bring? And I didn't know what she meant when it came to communication. So I went in and said, I don't know what you mean by value for communication, which was terrifying, but I knew I had to ask this to unlock this relationship. And they replied and said, oh, it's about risk and reputation. So I changed all of my narrative about what I was doing to be about risk and reputation rather than engagement, because engagement just wasn't of interest to them. And the value was more about the risk and reputation. So you have to listen to what people around you are talking about and frame things in the language of the business. We're very good at creating buzzwords in the communication and employee engagement experience industry, which don't always help us talk to business leaders in the way that they need us to talk to them. I think I've got time for one more. I've got 5 minutes. Let's see how quickly I can get through them. So Karina, we've got one from you saying, when creating a communication plan, aligning it to the organization goals, do we need to create smart comms objectives, or is this more for a strategy? I guess in terms of managing time, how much time do you give to a comms plan for a learning and development unit? Like, how detailed? Okay, that's fine. It's a great question. I have got a template comms plan that I can send you, which has got the different sections in it that I used to complete. I don't mind a smart objective. There's some stuff in the Ali Abdaal book about the danger of smart goals. So I might do a little post on LinkedIn about that next week. The main thing is that they need to be measurable. So if you've been asked to create a communications plan linked to a need to improve health and safety because we need to reduce accidents by 60% as an organization, that's what I want to measure. I want to measure that 60% because I'll be part of that. So I can't take all the credit as much as I'd want to, because there will be training and development, there will be this, there will be that, but actually that's the measure. And if we don't hit that 60%, then we need to do other things with training and other stuff, and we need to find out what's worked and what hasn't. So my plan is all there to hit that business goal. And I'll do that in line with whatever other activities going on. But we know as comms people that if we want to reduce accidents, then we need to create a campaign because we're changing behavior. So that campaign needs to involve, probably video, probably photo, probably something that's going to disrupt people in their everyday so that they stop and do things differently. We've got to draw on some of those different elements of comms to be able to do that. In terms of the how much time do you give staff? Sometimes I've worked with people who have created different tiers. I never did this, but I quite like it. So you'd have like a bronze, silver and gold package of support from your central comms function. So if you meet this criteria, it's like a bronze support. If it's this criteria, it's silver. And if it's this criteria, then it's gold. And that would determine how much time and budget and effort from the team supports that. I think that's very specific to you as a organization, but I think it's worth looking at your ways of working to see whether that might be an option for managing time and energy and effort. Because if there is lots coming, and some of it is things like, could you make this PowerPoint look better versus could you create a massive campaign to support accidents? Actually the PowerPoint, I've got a bit of budget and I can give that to a graphic designer that's freelance that can work behind the scenes and do that for them. So that works. That might be like a bronze. Whereas this big campaign needs gold, and that needs me and my time. It depends whether the bronze, silver and gold maps to your time or budget or whatever it might be. But like I said, I always had this sort of bank of people behind me that were external, that was a copywriter, a graphic designer, my magazine team, intranet team, so a PR agency that would come in and do stuff where there was little bits of budget here and there. And that made my life a lot easier. I was a tiny team, so I didn't have the luxury of being able to be everywhere. So I had to be quite smart with what I could do and what was in my zone of genius versus what might be in someone else's. Because I can pretty up a PowerPoint, but it's not my zone of genius. Like there's other people that can do that a lot better. And it's a better use of budget and time for someone else to do that. And so it's understanding some of those things as well. I think that brings us to time. So it was a very big whistle-stop tour of sort of stakeholders, prioritizing time. So much of it does come down to your judgment. And I know that sometimes sounds a bit hard, but your judgment is really important as a communication professional. You are the expert. You know what you're doing, whether it's comms, HR, employee experience. You know what you need to do in terms of your time and your energy. It's just having the ability to manage some of those relationships to do it, and use some of these tools, play with them, test them, see what works. But understanding your stakeholders, using things like a RACI are really simple ones that would help you just break that down a little bit more. Thank you very much for joining me. As I said, I'll be back on the 11th of February for a session on change comms, which I'm very excited about. And I hope to see some of you, if not all of you, then. Thank you very much for tuning in wherever you are. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, rest of the day. Thank you very much.